Okay, well, I think that we have our guests are starting to join us. If you'll just give us a minute or two just to let everybody come in, we'll be starting shortly, but thank you so much for joining us. And again, for people who are joining us right now, we're just going to give it another minute or two before we begin. Thank you, everyone, for your patience, and we look forward to discussing more shortly. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and begin. Thank you all for joining us this evening for Dr. Maha Hilal's book launch for Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. My name is Tasnim Motala. I am both a friend and colleague of Maha's, and I am so thrilled and flattered to be here and to be joining Maha in this important conversation. Um, before we begin, I'll just give a quick intro to myself, and then also kind of my background, and as well as introducing Maha and this book. So I currently serve as defense counsel to one of the men charged in Guantanamo Bay. He's being charged in the military commissions. But prior to that, I had done a lot of work on some of the men who are not charged in Guantanamo Bay, as well as representing a brother who was held in U.S. military bases in Bagram, Afghanistan. And through my work is actually how I met Maha. We go back from when we were both students, Maha doing her PhD and me in law school. And, you know, we were I'd be remiss if I did not say that we met through an organization called the Islamic Scholarship Fund. But I got to know Maha and her work as not just as an academic, but also Maha as an organizer and an activist. You know, when I first went down to Guantanamo Bay in my current role, one of the first things that one of the brothers down there asked me, tried to understand, you know, kind of my cred, so to speak, was whether I knew Maha. So that's really just kind of how far-reaching Maha's work and her successes are, that, you know, some of that even the brothers down in Guantanamo Bay who are essentially held incommunicado know of Maha. So Maha's book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, is definitely a work of love. It's something that I think came from both her experience in the academy as a PhD student, a PhD scholar, but also through her work as an activist and an organizer, and also through her lived experiences of being a visibly Muslim woman post 9/11. And Maha's voice and Maha's role is very unique. I haven't read any other book that really comes to some of these conclusions from the perspective that Maha does. And I think that, when everyone gets a chance to go through the book, they also will be similarly impressed and intrigued. And I think we'll have a lot to learn from Maha's contributions. One more thing before I turn it over to Maha, and I apologize for not flagging this beforehand, but as you can see, we have Sister Rashida here, who is our ASL interpreter. And if anybody needs cart captioning, there is a link at the bottom where you can access that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Maha. Before we kind of start our conversation, Maha has put together a presentation for us that kind of gives us some of the language and vocabulary that she introduces through her book around Islamophobia and the war on terror, and the confluence of the two. So I'm going to turn it over to Maha to help create this foundation for us before we begin our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tasnim, for the lovely introduction and for being here with me. Yes, Tasnim has talked a little bit about our history, and when I was thinking about who I would want to introduce me tonight, Tasnim was my number one choice. We have long bonded over the state violence of this country and the crimes of this country, and more so how we can resist the violence. And I think it's that camaraderie and support that we've given each other, I think, that has allowed us to keep fighting, not just Guantanamo and for its closure and an end to torture, but also to the many crimes of the US government in the context of the war on terror. So I have put together a presentation, as Tasnim has said, and so I'll just give you all a sort of an overview of the book and what I attempt to do with this book. What are my political goals for the book? Just to give you a sense of, where is this headed? Where is my work headed? Where have we been? And how do we understand the war on terror after 20 years? I should note that, I am obviously Muslim, and I came to this work because of my identity as a Muslim. In 2007, I had done an internship at Amnesty International in what was then called the Denounce Torture Initiative. And that specific program was focused on Guantanamo Bay and ending torture. And obviously, for anyone who's actually examining and critically looking at Guantanamo Bay, the most obvious observation is that all of those who've been detained in post 9/11 at Guantanamo have been Muslim men. And to me, that was a very clear example of the extent to which the United States would go to criminalize Muslim communities, and also the ways in which Islamophobia has been so deeply entrenched in the war on terror. Many of you are familiar with my work, and specifically, again, the work that I've done challenging Islamophobia in the war on terror. And so you're probably not surprised that I start with this quote. So the quote is from former President Bush, from a speech he gave to a joint session of Congress on September 20th, 2001, 9 days after the 9/11 attacks. So former President Bush said, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated." Now, the reason I start with this quote is, number one, this is the first time that the phrase war on terror was used by Bush, and obviously that has great implications, not just for how the war started, but also how the war has perpetuated. And second, because what Bush was outlining, although not explicitly, and perhaps now in hindsight, is that the war on terror would in fact be a never-ending, nebulous war whose theoretical goal of combating terrorism would naturally lead to no conclusion and no end. And this is very important because what we saw in the early days of the war on terror was that Bush was fundamentally setting up the blueprint, not necessarily the extent of the violence that would be inflicted through the course of the war on terror, but the infrastructure that would allow for that violence. And of course, this is important 20 years after the War on Terror, especially because we know the War on Terror is not coming to an end. And despite what the United States says, whether it was last August when the US withdrew from Afghanistan, or when the war theoretically ended in Iraq, the War on Terror is omnipresent. And it is not just something that is felt only when there are troops on the ground. So again, this is very important to remember as we think about the War on Terror and its evolution 20 years later. Can you go back one? One more? Dev, can you go back one more? Okay, one more forward. Okay. So as you can imagine, when I was doing research for this book, which was very extensive, because how could you possibly capture 20 years of the War on Terror? I came across an op-ed that was written by Ben Rhodes, who was the former Deputy National Security Advisor to Barack Obama. And the title of his op-ed was "The 9/11 Era is Over." Now, the question was, to me, what does that actually mean? Who is the 9/11 era over for? And how do we know that this 9/11 era is over? If we looked at whatever he was measuring this by, the only way we could conceive of this 9/11 era being over is because the War on Terror has been so deeply entrenched and normalized in the course of our daily lives that it no longer stands out, that we can't even extricate ourselves from the ways that this war has operated and now has become such a seamless part of the way we think about national security. But in the op-ed, he also says that there's a sign in the CIA that says every day is September 12th. I found this interesting, of course, because what this sign and this idea is meant to instill is that the United States is always under threat, right? And it is always the target, right? It is never the perpetrator, but rather the United States is the victim and the target. And when we think about this, if every day is September 12th, that also means everything the United States does is justified. Because again, we are the ones that are constantly under attack. To this end, I developed and really thought carefully about what my political goals were for this book project. And the first was remembering. Every year on 9/11, we hear the common phrase or the refrain, "We will never forget." Of course, for many of us who grew up in the post 9/11 era, this is something that has been seared into our memory. What isn't remembered, however, are the victims of the War on Terror. The individuals who have been tortured by the CIA, the people, mostly men, who have been targeted by informants, many of whom are now in prison, having been convicted of terrorism-related charges. And I can go on, right? And in the book, I detail so much of what the War on Terror has meant. But again, the important part is that when we talk about remembrance, it's never about these people. But my book is, because in my mind, these are the people, it is my community as well, that needs to be remembered when we talk about the impact of the war on terror and everything that has happened post 9/11. Another political goal was to denormalize the war on terror. As I mentioned earlier, it is almost now impossible to extricate ourselves. What does it mean to live in a world without the war on terror, without body scanners, right? Without surveillance so normalized and so tethered and attached to fear? What would it look like if Guantanamo Bay was abolished and was a relic of the past? These things should not be normal. And my book project, as one that surveys the last 20 years of the war on terror, is about denormalizing everything that the war on terror has become. It's also about recalibrating. In other words, to radically re-examine how national security is viewed. Of course, we can go into the term itself, national security, and find numerous and fundamental problems with that. But in the specific context of the war on terror, what we need to radically re-examine is national security that has been based on and rooted in the dehumanization of Muslims. And finally, something that speaks to that is resisting. I think one of the most powerful examples of resistance has been the voices of many of the Muslim men who were formerly detained at Guantanamo Bay. You may be familiar with many of them, such as Muhammad Uslahi, Mansour Adaifi, Mazam Beg. All of these individuals are resisting the narratives that have been told about them. And this book project is also about resisting these stories and understanding that we are at an impasse. And after 20 years, it is time to do something differently, that it is untenable to continue to fight the war on terror. For many of you who know about the work that I've done in the context of Guantanamo, you know that one of the fundamental ideas that I've continued to push is that Guantanamo's operation relied on and continues to rely on Islamophobia as a system of oppression. It is the reason why the prison has operated the way it has. It's the reason why many of the men, in fact, most of the men who have gone through Guantanamo have been innocent of any crimes. And it is the reason why so much of the violence has become acceptable. And so what I attempt to do in this book and what I have done in the last couple of years of my writing is to really emphasize how deeply entrenched Islamophobia is in the war on terror. In addition, right, this is not just about intentionally interjecting this analysis. It's also to combat the fact that after 20 years, many of these analyses are incomplete. And this is not just about those who are center or right of center. This is also the case in liberal and progressive circles. Further, this book is also about going beyond a basic observation, for example, that all of those detained at Guantanamo were Muslim. Perhaps that's a step forward. I can tell you that that's an acknowledgement and a recognition that wasn't made when I first started this work. However, what do we do with that information? What does that actually mean? And how does it lead us to understanding the idea that if we want to dismantle the war on terror, we have to simultaneously dismantle Islamophobia. So my book is structured in 3 parts. Some of you may have already started reading it. But of course, this is a big project and was a big project. How do we understand again the war on terror after 2 decades? As someone who has been extremely interested in the narratives that have perpetuated Islamophobia, I dedicate the first part to examining not just the story that was told about the 9/11 attacks. For example, who were the perpetrators? Why did they attack the United States? What this country is fundamentally about? How we are going to construct terrorism. But again, this idea that Islamophobia has been so deeply entrenched in the narrative. And it's, of course, not accidental. Narratives shape the way we see problems. Narratives also give power to certain people over others. If you have the power to define, for example, what terrorism means, then anything you call, any tactics you employ under the guise of counterterrorism becomes legitimate. Of course, as I talk about in the book, we can look to the question of moral equivalencies. And there's a lot more I could say at this point. But needless to say, narratives help justify and legitimize the policies and laws of the war on terror. Which leads to the second part of the book. Again, with the goal of really highlighting the ways in which Islamophobia has been entrenched. I specifically look at the ways in which, in the second part on institutionalized Islamophobia, differential justice has been the only thing that has been afforded to Muslims. Of course, we know that many policies that are neutral on their face, or have been neutral on their face, have inevitably and almost exclusively targeted Muslims. However, we can look at policy design, whether it's NCERS or the Muslim ban, and understand who the primary targets have been, and in fact, of course, who the intended targets were from the very beginning. And so the importance of this section is to really underscore and challenge the idea that Muslims have only been targeted. It's sort of a coincidence, right? That Muslims were targeted, or an unintended consequence. However, we know that that's not the case. From its inception, the targeting of Muslims has been intentional. And finally, I look at internalized Islamophobia and Muslim responses, Muslim American responses specifically to the war on terror. Why is this important? When communities, especially marginalized communities, live in a context in which a form of oppression that targets them is rampant and weaponized, it is often the case that those targeted begin to internalize some of the problematic ideas that they are taught about their group and their community. Of course, it doesn't just end there. It's not just about feelings of disparagement towards one's own group members. In my book specifically, it's about the ways in which this is institutionalized, such that Muslims themselves participate in the violence of the state and end up becoming agents of injustice. Now, of course, we can, have conversations, and I'm sure there will be plenty, that follow about the intentions of those who might be perceived as doing this work. But needless to say, it has been an observable consequence of the war on terror that, again, Muslims themselves have internalized these very problematic ideas. And when I say problematic ideas, this includes, for example, that Muslims are inherently violent, that they're predisposed to committing acts of terrorism, that Muslims are uniquely patriarchal or misogynistic. And while it doesn't necessarily bear noting, I will say that, of course, this does not mean that any critiques of Islam are inherently and necessarily Islamophobic, but that in the absence of any comparative evidence, any absorbing of those ideas are often problematic. So as a book project whose goal, or I should say my goal in the book project, was to underscore how institutionalized Islamophobia operates. If you've read my work before, you know that I focus heavily on the idea of social constructions. And when I talk specifically about institutionalized Islamophobia, this is meant to convey the ways that this form of oppression is again embedded into the structures of the state. It is often the case that when we talk about Islamophobia, people refer to or might be thinking of interpersonal Islamophobia. Of course, that is important to address. However, institutionalized Islamophobia, which again involves targeting by the state, is important in and of itself, but also because of the message it sends to members of society as to what sort of treatment is acceptable for Muslims. And so some of the specific constructions, as I conceive of them, that I believe are part of Islamophobia, is the idea or trope of Muslims of Islam as violent, barbaric, uncivilized, opposed to normative democratic values. These are things that are commonly said and very frequently said. And of course, what happens when we repeat those things is that Muslims get pushed out of these moral boundaries. Ideas about which communities and which people are deserving of certain standards of justice and fairness. Obviously, there are a range of consequences, we know, whether it's profiling, whether it's detention, whether it's torture, or murder. And finally, it bears noting that when I think of Islamophobia, and in the many discussions that have been had about Islamophobia, it is difficult to specifically articulate what is this phenomenon that we're talking about. This is particularly the case because Muslims are such a diverse community, and there are multiple systems of oppression operating at the same time, whether it's anti-Blackness, whether it's racism, whether it's cultural racism, whether it's xenophobia. And so we also have to understand that this form of oppression and anti-religious animus is operating at the intersection of these different identities that Muslims hold. I've spoken to this point quite extensively, earlier in the presentation. But one of the ways I talk about internalized Islamophobia in the book is this frequent rush to condemn acts of violence that are perpetrated by Muslims by other Muslims. So, for example, when the Muslim man took congregants hostage at a synagogue, Jewish congregants, several Muslim organizations put out statements condemning the act of violence. Now, of course, the event was tragic. There's no doubt about it. But the idea that Muslims are all tethered to the acts of violence by other Muslims is a symptom of internalized Islamophobia. And we know this because when other individuals who are part of other groups whose members commit acts of violence, they are not called on to do the same, nor do they volunteer to do the same. At the same time, one of the ways this is manifested is in condemning acts of violence perpetrated against other groups, while at the same time denying or minimizing Muslim victimhood. Because apparently, for some people, right, for some Muslims, the way that this manifests is that Muslims should be denied victimhood. So, what is the war on terror? I asked myself that many times when I was writing this book. How do we actually understand what it is? In many of the social justice movements that I've been a part of, we talk about dismantling and abolishing the war on terror. But what is it, again, that we are talking about? So, in my conception and research of the war on terror, I wanted to better understand. And when I did research on this, on the war on terror, most of the time, it was narrowly reduced to militarism and warfare abroad. And of course, that doesn't even cover countries that the United States is intervening in, but which it is not technically at war with. So, in other words, it's important to understand the purview of the war on terror because of the amount of violence that is so easily disguised. So I developed a taxonomy or framework of the war on terror that is composed of 5 dimensions. This includes militarism and warfare, draconian immigration policies, surveillance, federal terrorism prosecutions, and detention and torture. And another reason for creating this framework is to really break down how the government's different types of control over different parts of our social and political life has been impacted by this violence. In addition, it is often the case that there has been this intentional and artificial separation of what happens at the domestic level versus what is happening at the international level. Now, there are a number of reasons why we can surmise that this is happening, including, for example, intervening in potentials for transglobal solidarity. But really, it's to disguise how aspects of how these different dimensions of the war on terror and the ways it's been fought are so interconnected. We know that federal terrorism prosecutions, for example, have involved witnesses from other countries. We know, for example, in the Holy Land 5 case, that the reason why the 5 men who ran the foundation were targeted was primarily because of the construction of Hamas as a terrorist organization and the idea in that particular case that because they were giving money to these zakat foundations, which coincidentally so was the USAID, It was what they said, what the government argued, could free up resources for an organization like Hamas to enact its violence. And there are a lot of elements and specificities and details and ways that this violence, in particular in the federal terrorism prosecution context, has been inflicted. But again, the point here is that what happens domestically and what happens abroad are interconnected. Alongside this framework and taxonomy of understanding the dimensions of the war on terror is a corollary to the modes of violence that have been used in the course of fighting this war. Now, the reason I wanted to think about these modes of violence was because they really speak to how viscerally it impacts people and how widespread the violence is. So, in the course of the war on terror, the modes of violence include corporeal, bordered, panoptic, juridical, and carceral. There are overlaps, of course, in these different modes of violence, but they offer, or at least the intention is to offer, a framework through which we begin to understand how this violence has been enacted on actual bodies. And from that point, and through understanding these modes, to think about other ways that the violence has impacted those who have been targeted. I'm guessing some of you may remember this a really interesting quote by Donald Rumsfeld in 2002, where he said, quote, "As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things that we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know." Yeah, I would say it's very hard not to laugh at what is expressed by Rumsfeld's statements here. And what he was essentially saying, right, is we have to wage war. We have to wage this war on terror in a certain way because we don't know the extent of the threats. That it is therefore justified to adopt a preemptive approach. And preemptive is not preventative, right? Those are two different things. It's also about instilling paranoia, right? What are the things that we don't even know we don't know about when we're going to become a target, right? Or when is the person that we freed from Guantanamo Bay going to enact an act of violence out of revenge? What are the things we don't know that we don't know? Essentially, we can then remain trapped indefinitely in this way of fighting the war on terror. That suggests it's okay to guess. Well, we don't know, so, we just bombed a country in the Arab world, but that's because we don't know what we don't know. And that is a threat to our safety and security. And then this, of course, becomes the only justification that is needed. So as you can see on this picture, it's graffiti from Yemen. And in the picture, there's a young boy walking past this picture, and the writing says, "Why did you kill my family?" Now, let's juxtapose that with the two quotes on the top and bottom. So, on September 11th, former President Bush said, "Today our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature." On the bottom, former President Obama said, "We can't erase every trace of evil from the world, and small groups of killers have the capacity to do great harm. That was the case before 9/11, and that remains true today. And that's why we must remain vigilant as threats emerge." So, first of all, the use of the word evil has been frequently used in the course of the War on Terror. And it's a very intentional choice of words, which is meant to convey an inherent characteristic, and one that can only be combated through brute force. If someone is fundamentally evil, there's nothing you can do to reform that person. So again, this rhetoric has repeatedly been used. Second is a very extensive point that I impart in the book, which is the fact that the War on Terror has always been about social constructions and who has the power to define the war and the terms on which it is fought. And that is a thread that runs throughout the book, and something that is very critical to understanding. Not just, again, how the War on Terror, how the story of the 9/11 attacks were told, also how the war has evolved and why it continues to be perpetuated 20 years later with no end in sight. And finally, as this comic shows, there really is no end. Per the quote from President Bush in the beginning, this war was not designed to have an end, especially not when the United States takes no responsibility or accountability whatsoever, and when it consistently defaults to the idea that it is a benevolent, democratic country that adheres to the rule of law. Again, we are at an impasse. It's been 20 years. And so the question is that I hope and seek to answer in this book is, what does resistance look like? And in large part, that involves challenging the status quo, not just in terms of the narratives we use to challenge the dominant discourse, but the ways in which we fight back against harmful and destructive policies, where we are not negotiating our humanity, but making sure our humanity is recognized. Needless to say, after having written a book on the War on Terror at this juncture in time, it is a difficult project, has been a difficult project. And as those of us in this space and beyond, and those of us who are actively committing and committed to challenging the War on Terror, what my hope is that this book really fundamentally roots how deeply entrenched Islamophobia has been in this project of the War on Terror from the beginning, and that the War on Terror has always been a project of empire. And so when we try to understand it, we can understand some nuances between the different presidential administrations. But we recognize that state violence is bipartisan. And it is through that recognition and with that perspective that we need to confront, challenge, disrupt the war on terror. Because, as I say in the book, after 20 years, there's so much at stake. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maha. That was really helpful, I think, even for me to kind of get a sense of the history of how we got to where we are today. And I think, you know, something that both your presentation and your book do so well is kind of capturing how wild and hysterical and chaotic the days immediately after September 11th were, and how that kind of chaos and hysterics created policy or justified policy, and then how those policy decisions were entrenched. And they're entrenched today, and now it's just seen as the norm. And I think your presentation did a really great job of kind of bringing back to like the sort of rhetoric that was used in 2001 and how that rhetoric continues to justify through presidential administrations to today. And in some ways, I think, you know, your book is not just a political book, it's also a historical book, right? Like you talk about a lot of the history of it. You also talk about, you know, the politics. And this is, I think, what makes your book really, really unique is that it's not just one thing. You cover the political science, you cover law, you cover sociology, you cover history, but also it's something that's deeply personal, right? This is something that you've experienced elements of this kind of individually, perhaps interpersonally, but also, you know, as part of our communities, our Muslim communities. Can you tell me, like, one, what led you to write this book, and also tell me a little bit more about the process or the risks of doing this work specifically as a Muslim woman?
So there's a lot that I can, you know, say about what led me to write this book. But the thing that, you know, comes to my mind is there have been so many times, and I'm sure that you've also been in this situation, Tasnim, where I've been in meetings where Guantanamo is discussed or where surveillance is discussed. And when I bring up the fact, for example, that everyone at Guantanamo has been Muslim post 9/11, it is treated as sort of irrelevant or inconvenient. And I have continued to face this frustration because I have literally never come to an understanding as to why this is such a difficult fact to accept. We know that social constructions, as I've talked about extensively and in the book, this is not just about national security. We know the ways that it shows up in other contexts. It is not something that is hard to see. So, you know, one of the sort of emblematic examples is drug sentencing laws, right? We know that the sentencing is not based on the lethality of a drug, but rather the construction of people who are thought to use that drug. That's what explains the discrepancy. And so to me, why I wanted to write this book was to really create a political document, I think, that would really solidify this idea that the war on terror is not an accident in terms of its targeting of Muslims. And that, again, that it's so critical and imperative to understand. And, you know, there's been a lot of advocacy, of course, on Islamophobia. And a lot of it skirts past this. And again, it's something that I've never really quite understood, especially when we have so many people who have been targeted who have spoken out about this and who know that it's because they were Muslim. So again, to me, this is a very important political project and something that, after having worked with many survivors of US state violence, seemed imperative after 20 years of this catastrophic war. Now, in terms of sort of the risks, right? A lot of us in the social justice communities, right, understand that with greater visibility comes greater risk. Of course, that also depends on what the content of your writing is, of your speech. To what extent are you challenging the status quo? As someone who I think, you know, the sort of having this integral idea of confronting state violence directly, I'm aware that this might lead to greater scrutiny. I have not left the country in many years now, and quite frankly, I would not be surprised if I had issues upon my return. And this is not because I'm famous or anything, right? It's about the United States government also using different Muslims or different marginalized communities, people within them, as examples of what will happen to you if you also choose to speak out. And so this work very much does come with risk. And particularly, I think one of the reasons why this is such a challenge to the US government is because they have tried so hard to convince everyone, including Muslims, for example, that those who were tortured by the CIA were terrorists, or those who were at Guantanamo are all terrorists. But then what does it mean when Muslims like me and you are coming to their defense? Because we recognize the extent of the violence in the war on terror. And that is a direct threat to the US government.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think something that your book does such a really fantastic job of doing is just tying together all of these different strands, right? Like that you make such a direct and clear comparison of the situation of the men in Guantanamo Bay to the situation of Muslims who are trapped from within our communities to the surveillance of our mosques and other community spaces, and really kind of like really just showing that these are not disparate issues, they're so linked. And so when you bring in Islamophobia to the kind of the rhetoric or the narrative around here, it's not coming out of thin air. It's such a clear connection between all these different systems of oppression, or if anything, it's the unifying thing behind the systems of oppression. And we see it kind of also in the legal space too, right? You'll see people kind of making these arguments about how, this is, a violation of this constitutional amendment, but like really failing to take into account or really failing to reckon with the underlying issue that this is actually an issue of discrimination. It's not just a constitutional violation. That it's no coincidence that all the men in Guantanamo Bay are Muslim, or most of the men that are held in special administrative measures are Muslim. It's no coincidence. Something else your book really places a large emphasis on is the role of narrative, arguing that the narrative has played a major role in where we are today, and then also narrative will play or must play a large role in dismantling these Islamophobic structures and systems. Could you expand on that and tell me some ways that narrative has entrenched the war on terror, and then how we can use narrative to play a role in dismantling it?
Absolutely. So I talked a little bit about narrative earlier, but the importance of narrative and language is that it determines how we see the world, right? And when we're talking about public policy, the government has to utilize a specific narrative to get people in the United States to understand why they chose the intervention that they did. So, in the war on terror, for example, right? One of the ways of doing this, of justifying brute force, was to construct terrorists, and terrorists first as a construction in and of itself, but to construct these people who had waged the attacks on the United States as evil, right? Again, that they're inherently evil, they're irredeemable. And again, when we construct people like that, then there are few options in terms of what a counterterrorism tactic looks like. We know in the early days of the War on Terror, I think in the same speech on September 20th, Bush said, Americans are asking, why do they hate us? As I talk about in the book, it was unclear. Was that really what Americans were asking? And if it wasn't, that's what he was instructing them and priming them to ask. And further, why they hate us was constructed as being about our, quote, freedom and democracy. And again, if that's the reason why the 9/11 attacks happened, it, of course, leads back to irredeemability. And this is a very, especially problematic way the narrative is used, right? Especially when we look at state violence versus non-state actor violence. That is a huge way the narrative displays power. Who has the power to define what actions count as terrorism or not? And one of the things I write about, for example, is about moral equivalence. If we compared the actions of the state, in many cases, to the actions of non-state actors, there would essentially be no difference. The difference, however, is because the state gets to define terrorism, that one becomes seen as moral and the other as immoral and illegitimate. And of course, again, when we talk about state violence, this rests on, and the ability to conduct state violence is based on so many Orientalist ideas of Muslims, right? Muslims are uncivilized, Muslims are barbaric, right? Muslims are predisposed to committing acts of violence. And so again, when we use and repeat these narrative constructions of the people who are being targeted by the war, it becomes acceptable. I remember in 2014, there was an opinion poll after the Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture came out. And one of the questions that was asked, in light of what had surfaced, being some of the most egregious forms of torture, was whether or not the torture was justified. And 49% said it was. Now keep in mind, the question was not whether it was legal, moral, or ethical. It was about whether it was justified. And again, that is the power of language. Because if you can inject that sort of understanding into the committing of state violence, then it becomes justified. People think it's justified, it becomes justified. And so state violence and terrorism and all of these constructions have really been weaponized against Muslim communities vis-a-vis narrative.
And so, I understand that, we kind of talk about this creation or the use of the term terrorist or terrorism to describe those who committed the September 11th attacks. And I understand that, we are trying to push back against that narrative, but also at the same time that we should not be perhaps too fixated on what members of Al Qaeda have done, right? Because there's so much more to this discussion than that. But I think perhaps is there a utility to even engaging with Al Qaeda's perspective? Is it important for us to perhaps to even as as American Muslims who are engaged in this space to be talking about, like, how do we define Al Qaeda, and two, how do we reckon with their perspective?
Well, the interesting thing about Al Qaeda is that it's not as though they've been devoid of having a voice. If you want to find information about their perspective, or ideology, and I'm not even sure what exactly how you would categorize or think about their ideology. But if you actually wanted to know, you could know. And this goes back to Rumsfeld, right? Unknown unknowns. And the US government absolutely knows the contents of what Osama bin Laden's speeches, letters, whatever he has produced, propaganda videos, statements, etc. But of course, the American public is not privy to that. And I know that you and I just watched the documentary Jihad Rehab.
Unfortunately, we have.
Which is a terrible documentary. But one of the things one of the former prisoners says is, no one asked me why he went to fight, right? No one asked me why. And the reason no one asked him why is because it doesn't matter. Because that's not going to change the narrative in terms of what the United States prescribes as the reason why this person or any terrorist or anyone constructed as terrorist goes to fight. And, one thing that's interesting is that in 2012, there was this report that was conducted by researchers from Arizona State University, their Center for Strategic Communications, and they actually analyzed 2,000 items of propaganda from Al-Qaeda. And it's a very interesting report, of course. It is from 2012. But what they find is that most of the rhetoric that they're espousing is about enduring hardship, and it's about revenge. It is not about taking over the world, right, and establishing a global Muslim community or taking over the world, but rather, again, is about the harms that they've experienced. And I've not looked
very much also anti-imperialism.
Right. And so, this is also comes back to narrative, right? Because the United States does not want Americans to know what is being said. And they don't want to examine root causes. Because root causes, if we understood what they were, would fundamentally disrupt how this war has been fought and is being fought.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, were you done? I was going to say, even if you kind of, it's interesting because, a lot of our conversation is around kind of how the U.S. government categorizes these groups of people. But even, if we can take it back to Jihad Rehab, which, as Maha said, is a recent release at Sundance on the quote-unquote jihad rehabilitation centers that men released from Guantanamo Bay to Saudi Arabia are forced to undergo before being re-entered into society. The woman who made that is an ostensibly liberal woman who, said she wants to kind of get us provide like a very even-handed view of what a quote-unquote terrorist, how a quote-unquote terrorist thinks or conceives of the world. But even in a movie like that, there was just really no grappling kind of with the context behind where these men came from, how they entered the battlefield as children, what were the driving forces, what were their families like. There was really no sort of grappling with that. And so even when you think that the most liberal people who seem to be open-minded to engaging with these topics fail to even grapple with this imperialism that really does seem to be at the core of a lot of how a lot of these men got to where they were.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, and also kind of makes me think about the narratives I highlight in the book where former President Bush repeatedly talked about history, and specifically about essentially history starting after 9/11.
Yeah.
So there was nothing pre 9/11 that could have informed any understanding of what happened and why the United States had been targeted.
Yeah.
But history started when the 9/11 attacks happened.
Yeah, completely. And as you said, conveniently, if we start history from there, then the United States looks like the victim, and the United States is uniquely the victim in a way that no other group is. Your book does a tremendous job of kind of detailing all the facets of the war on terror, from drones to Guantanamo to kind of the immigration apparatus. If we're thinking of kind of the war on terror writ large, um, what as kind of like perhaps like a means, towards something. What is the end? Like, what is the goal of the war on terror? Was it simply an executive power grab? Was it pure hatred of Muslims? Was it, misguided attempts of valor and revenge? What in your interpretation is the overall purpose behind the war on terror?
Well, that's a good question, right? Because we have the narrative repeatedly saying, right, the purpose of the war on terror is to combat terrorism. At the same time, we know that the interventions and tactics that the United States government has employed has done the exact opposite and has done nothing to really address the perpetuation of conflict. This actually makes me think, and I think you and I have had conversations about it, makes me think of the question of around the 9/11 anniversary, the 20-year anniversary, people kept saying that the war on terror was a failure. And to me, that's sort of a subsequent question to the one you've asked me, because what are the rubrics we're using to understand what would make this war a failure, right? So if we think about what has resulted as a result of the war on terror, right? The United States has cemented a foothold in Africa, vis-a-vis AFRICOM, for example, right? The United States has also continued to colonize and occupy Iraq and Afghanistan. And with Afghanistan in particular, using this paternalistic narrative, actually in both contexts, but there's a particular way it's weaponized and used in the Afghanistan context, to suggest that the United States is the savior. And of course, we know that the United States is interested in intervening, colonizing, and consolidating and entrenching its empire. And the war on terror as a project successfully got it closer to that goal. We know, for example, the war on terror has led to profits in the billions, right? Whether it's defense contractors, whether it's private military contractors. Moreover, the war on terror was about, and has always been about, creating and entrenching an infrastructure and apparatus so that even when or if Muslims are no longer the direct targets, the same tactics can be used and weaponized against other groups. Of course, the war on terror at present, and as it has been for the last 2 decades, uniquely targets Muslims. But we know that United States, when it comes to the wars that it has waged, they never actually end, as I argue in the book. They just morph into new wars that preserve everything that has happened in the past and the extent to which marginalized communities can be targeted, either because of the sophistication of weaponry or because of the entrenchment of a collective hatred of groups that don't identify as what is seen as American or American Christian, white American Christians. And so I think, to answer your question more concisely, I think it is exactly about the expansion of the military-industrial complex. And the United States, we know, is not interested in peace. Although there's a United States Institute of Peace, it's usually involved in perpetuating conflict, on a side note, but the United States has never really been interested in peace. And the war on terror has just given this government another excuse to inflict violence on a massive scale with no accountability whatsoever, both domestically and abroad.
Right. And I guess also, it's not necessarily just one thing, right? So, it certainly was, the war on terror certainly advance military-industrial complex goals, but simultaneously, in order to achieve that, they expanded executive power to an extent where, you know, a president eight years later can then enact a Muslim ban, right? An effective Muslim ban, right? And each of those things, you know, allowed them to build upon each other. Just, you know, I have a few more questions for you, but I'm also gonna just signpost to the audience that we're also going to be taking questions. So if people wanted to start putting questions in the chat, we'll turn to those in a moment. So you can start thinking about questions for us to get to. Maha, just shifting gears a little bit, right? So we've talked a lot kind of about the U.S. government's role, U.S. government's kind of more but you know, we also kind of you also talk a lot about Muslim. There's a lot of kind of critique on how Muslim organizations have responded to the war on terror, and you write a lot about internalized Islamophobia and also respectability politics. And as someone who's studied and also written a little bit about the civil rights movement, I was really kind of taken about by specifically your discussion on respectability politics and the comparison to the civil rights movement. And I've seen a lot of historical pieces kind of talking about the role respectability politics played, kind of for better or for worse, in the civil rights movement. And as a lawyer, you know, we also think about kind of like, you know, when we choose which lawsuits to bring, like, you know, who's going to be our plaintiff, who's going to be the person who the judge is most likely going to say, or that even the jury is going to most likely say, I identify with you. You are kind of the ideal person that I can sympathize with. Can you talk a little bit more about the respectability politics that you're critiquing amongst the Muslim community? And then also, I'm curious, you know, do you feel that this rhetoric ever has a place in our movements? Can it be used as sort of building block to more honest or radical or even like efficacious language or narrative that we can use it to build upon in the future? Or does it bring us back only?
Well, I know you and I have talked about this a lot. And, you know, to me, one of the initial questions I like to ask is, you know, what is the end goal? Is there a particular end goal that's in sight or is prescribed by engaging in these respectability politics? What do people expect will happen? And because we know it involves compromise, what are the compromises that have to be made to theoretically make the gains that you think will be made? And I think when it comes to the Muslim community, at least segments of it, of course, this is, you know, I do talk in my book that this is, of course, not a broad generalization, right? Because the community is so diverse. But for those sort of subgroups of Muslims that rely on respectability politics, it seems as though it's very devoid of any strategy whatsoever. And in many cases, it is not about improving the conditions of Muslims. It is about proximity to power. And that happens oftentimes because you are interested in or okay with participating in the oppression of your community members. So, you know, I think that it's very problematic. And I think along with this question is, you know, I've heard people in Muslim organizing spaces say, you know, it's okay that we use different tactics because we're all working towards the same goal. And to me, that is, you know, I categorically reject that because it is impossible to reach the same goal with vastly different tactics and strategies. And it is a very different strategy to want proximity to power than it is to want Muslim humanity to be recognized. So I have not found or observed in a lot of cases, right, the ways in which this language, you know, is utilized towards some sort of empowerment. That doesn't mean there hasn't been any, but, you know, I think it just continues to be very problematic, again, because there is this sort of lack of foresight. And I think not enough investment into understanding what sort of political goals can be accomplished if we have to resort to respectability politics. And also, what do we accomplish? Because inevitably, this strategy involves throwing certain Muslims under the bus. What are the gains that individuals and organizations that use this strategy think is going to outweigh that fact?
So on the topic of proximity to power, you also spend quite some time kind of critiquing how Muslim Americans have historically engaged with the political process, right? And how their only goal seems to be a seat at the table. That is their end goal, and particularly seats at the table that have no interest in them, right? So like, I want to be in the Pentagon decision-making room or the CIA decision-making room because it's important for me to be there. Has your perspective changed at all by the election of Muslim politicians like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib? Like, they're very vocal about challenging kind of U.S. imperialism and kind of these structural issues, and they also are very strongly advocating for the plight of Muslims abroad. So in some ways, they seem kind of different in kind from perhaps the Muslim that says, I need to be at the White House because it's important for me as a Muslim person to be there, and that is the end goal.
Right, that's a good question. I mean, I definitely think that with Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib in Congress, that has definitely, shifted my perspective somewhat, because as you've said, they have been very vocal about the ways that Muslims have been targeted, and or Palestinians in particular, and the many countries in the world that the U.S. has targeted. So I do think that there has been more room, at least, for rhetoric. I think the challenge to me is, understanding what are the limits of that. And if this is a strategy to be employed, which is to be a part of government, what is the external strategy that's used to complement this internal strategy? So, I know that Ilhan Omar, along with another congressperson, right, had proposed the Combating Global Islamophobia bill, which would specifically put a special envoy to combat Islamophobia in place. Now, of course, I'm sure it was not lost on Ilhan Omar the irony of having to create a position to fight global Islamophobia, while at the same time she has been a target of vicious Islamophobia herself. However, would it even be possible? And to what extent has the government, whether it's the Senate or the House, how willing have they actually been to address and confront Islamophobia, even in defense of their own colleague? So this is not to say that there is no room, but I think it still remains important to understand the limitations, right? And again, to be very intentional about the external and internal strategies. And I think that there's often a sort of disconnect, and it's not to say that I have figured this out. Of course, I have not. But I just think that, at this point in time, Muslims are still in the position of often recovering rights that they've lost or had stripped. And it's often less about advancing rights, right? So what does our actual participation in government mean at this juncture? And again, what compromises are involved and what is the trade-off? And I'm sure that both representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have thought of this. It's not, I'm not proposing something unique. Right. But just in terms of really advancing, because obviously the rhetoric and the analysis that I hold of the war on terror is probably not something that would be welcome, in particular in the halls of government.
Right. I'm going to turn it to questions from the audience. I see one question, and this is a personal one. Maha, how do you practice self-care while living in this reality?
So I tend to sort of resist the term self-care, and I think it's because to me it's more about collective care. And I have been fortunate enough to work with an amazing community, friends, including Tasnim, who's on the screen, and at least 5 people who are behind the scenes, literally on this broadcast, who really care about the work of social justice. And I think it is, that work and our, friendship in that space, I think that allows for me to be sustained, and I hope for me to sustain others. And self-care is also very difficult, right? In the context of an environment where you're constantly being bombarded. There's been times, for example, that I just want to lay down and watch a movie, and I'll be watching like a random Lifetime movie, and there'll be some like mention of a terrorist, and I'm like thrown off. I'm like, oh, I can't even watch like this stupid, useless movie without being reminded of something related to national security. So I don't mean to evade the question, but I think I've never really resonated. The term self-care has never really resonated with me. And I think that to me, I have found just care in the communities and friendships that I've built to really kind of empower each other and continue the struggle. And I think instill within each other that there is a reason to keep resisting.
Yeah. And I think also just a really helpful first step is just acknowledging that this work is really hard and it does drain you. And I think for the longest time, a lot of people, myself included, almost felt like it was weak or perhaps privileged to acknowledge that this work is hard and it does take a toll on you, and sometimes the most unexpected ways. And I think acknowledgement of that is oftentimes the first step before even you take time for yourself.
Right. And I have to say, I just see that as a very also like, to me, it just seems very American, especially because I grew up in a, Egyptian Muslim household, where, if I told my mom you need to practice self-care, it just would not be a concept that like resonated with her either. So I think it is really just about like really intentionally building community care. Yeah. Especially in the context of a country, the United States, where we're so individualistic and the work often is very difficult and very siloed.
Yeah, completely. Are there any more questions before perhaps we'll end with a quote, an excerpt from Maha? Give it another minute or two. I will just say that, Maha, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. I feel like I read the book, I've engaged with the book, but even just kind of talking through the book with you has just, I have like multiple pages kind of while you're giving your presentation full of notes and being like, oh, this is a really interesting point to turn back to. And I'm only sad that we only had, such a short period of time to talk about this, because there's just so much here that we could be talking about.
Thank you so much, Tasnim. And you've been such a huge part of my journey. And
you've been a big part of my journey. And also, I am not joking when I say, or like making light when I say that, for many brothers in Guantanamo, they're asking about Sister Maha and the work that she's doing. Maybe, Maha, we could end with perhaps an excerpt that you think is worth sharing for the audience, and then we can perhaps chat about how other people can access the book and further resources.
Awesome. So I'm going to read an excerpt from Chapter 3, which is titled Denying Muslim Humanity in the War on Terror, and the subsection is Not a Dent in the Narrative. So I start with a quote from Stephen Colbert on George Bush, who said, "The greatest thing about this man is he's steady. You know where he stands. He believes the same thing Wednesday that he believed on Monday, no matter what happened Tuesday. Events can change. This man's beliefs never will." The consequences of the official narrative that the United States has created and nourished, casting itself as the locus of reason and morality, and Muslims as terrorists motivated by blind hatred, are stark. Because of its commitment to promoting this story, no matter what kind of conduct the US engages in, or how egregiously that conduct offends moral decency, it will bend over backward to correct the image of itself and cast the behavior as the exception, preserving the sense of moral superiority that allows continued intervention around the world. A close examination of U.S. conduct during the War on Terror makes it extremely difficult to sustain the claim that there can be no moral equivalence between terrorist acts of violence and acts of violence committed by the U.S. Nevertheless, it is this basic framework that continues to animate discourse around the War on Terror. When the United States took control over Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, in place of a portrait of Saddam Hussein, they hung up a sign saying, quote, "America is the friend of all Iraqi people," end quote. This was a violent sign to put up, especially because of what the world would come to know about the treatment that Iraqi prisoners endured at the hands of the US government. As I mentioned briefly before, in 2004, photos emerged of some of the most egregious torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib, the most well-known of which involved the use of dogs to discipline and intimidate the detainees. A later report produced by Major General Anthony Taguba would painfully enumerate the depth of the misconduct there, which included physical and sexual abuse. When the horrific images of this abuse came out initially, President Bush was interviewed by Al Hurra television and was asked, among other things, what the U.S. could do to, quote, "get out of this," end quote. He replied, quote, "First, the people in Iraq must understand that I view these practices as abhorrent. They must also understand that what took place in that prison does not represent the America that I know. The America I know is a compassionate country that believes in freedom. The America I know cares about every individual. The America I know has sent troops to Iraq to promote freedom, good, honorable citizens that are helping the Iraqis every day." Far from expressing any semblance of accountability, the president's statement served to reiterate and center the narrative of the United States as a fundamentally benevolent country. As such, it was also a declaration of privilege, the privilege of the U.S. to maintain its exceptional identity no matter what the challenge to it. This example also underscores a fundamental discrepancy of the United States between, quote, "normative commitments and actual state practices," end quote. As we have seen, one of the most common rhetorical techniques used to minimize the contradiction between the values of the US as stated, the ones it purports to be defending, and its own apparent disregard for the same values in practice, is to present the perpetrators of any given incident as merely bad apples. And the situation is isolated and unrelated to policies from the highest level of government. This strategy relies on the enduring power of the dominant narrative to cue associations between the United States and its purported values automatically, and to preempt criticism by relying on the underlying assumption that anything the US does, even disregarding those values, is in service to them. On another occasion, when the Bush administration was responding to the Abu Ghraib photos, Rumsfeld wielded the violence to promote the United States' democratic values, saying, quote, "Our openness about the prison abuse is a lesson about the rule of law," end quote. What Rumsfeld failed to mention was that preserving the rule of law meant a lot more than acknowledging a violation of it. Uplifting US governance in spite of the Abu Ghraib scandal, Bush highlighted his leadership, saying, quote, "A dictator wouldn't be answering questions about this," end quote. While Bush apparently found cause to celebrate his style of leadership using the lowest threshold possible, he intentionally ignored the anti-democratic practices that his administration had engaged in to sanction torture. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Maha. That was really highlighted the power of rhetoric and also the power of pig-headedness. Maha, do you want to tell us how we can get your book, and also if people want to hear more about your writing or read more of your writing, how they can access that?
Yes, thank you so much, Tasnim. So you can buy my book at a number of different places. I am actively organizing against Amazon, so I usually prefer that people do not purchase it from Amazon. However, in the link tree, the link that's ticking on the bottom, you will find a link to where the book is on the publisher's website, and there are a number of options as to where to buy the book from. And in addition, that the link that's also scrolling on the bottom, you can find several of the op-eds and articles that I've written, probably about over the course of the last 5 years, and most of which center on the central themes of the book on dismantling institutionalized Islamophobia.
Great. And I think on that note, we will conclude. Thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Maha, for sharing your words and your thoughts and all of your studies with us. This was a really insightful conversation, and I hope our guests enjoyed it as well. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much, Tasnim, and thank you to everyone who joined tonight, and for everyone who has continued the work of resisting Islamophobia and the war on terror. And finally, thank you to Rashida, who is our intrepid ASL interpreter, who has done an incredible job in this event and beyond. So thank you all so much, and good night.